What's up, everybody? This is Master Ian Gamer. At long last, after years upon years of waiting, we've finally gotten the first installment of the Overwatch 2 PvE. We've gotten to play it, we've gotten to experience the story, and now it's time for me to share my honest thoughts. Now, admittedly, there is quite a bit to delve into here, even with only 3 story-based PvE missions and the bonus PvE event mission. I have quite a bit to discuss, so let me start by just doing a very quick synopsis rundown of the 3 main story campaign missions. First up is the mission set in Rio, where Overwatch agents team up with Lucio to fight through the streets of Rio de Janeiro before ultimately destroying the Null Sector command ship and thus saving the city. From there, we see the agents go back to Watchpoint Gibraltar, where they meet up with Cassidy, Farah, and a few other new recruits, who all then start planning their next missions. The next up of these missions is the one set in Toronto, where again, Overwatch travels to the city, this time meeting up with Sojourn. The mission itself starts off with the players defending a ferry as it evacuates citizens, before the team then ventures into the city itself, traveling through the Toronto subway system, where they discover that Omnic citizens are being subjugated, which entails having this strange sort of mind control / paralysis type device installed on their head, which basically renders them unable to function. After escaping the subway system, the team then moves through the stormy city to a dropship, where they're all then able to evacuate the city. This then takes us on to the third and final story mission, where Brigitte and Reinhardt travel to Gothenburg to meet up with Torbjorn and also end up meeting Bastion in the process. While there, Null Sector launches another attack on the city of Gothenburg, and the 4 heroes have to move through the streets activating various Torbjorn turrets in order to ward off the command ship before a Null Sector Titan then shows up, at which point the team has to fall back to Torbjorn's workshop to defend a giant mega turret as it powers up and ultimately saves the day by shooting the giant Titan. After this final mission, we get a post-credits cutscene featuring a flashback of Zenyatta's, where he recalls his time in the Shambali Monastery with Ramatra and Mundata. When the flashback ends, we cut back to present day, where we see Sombra, Widowmaker, and other Talon operatives find Zenyatta meditating in a temple. This presumably is an immediate precursor to the next upcoming story mission, but since we don't have that mission yet, we're not going to talk about it here today. So, having given the synopsis of the missions themselves, now I want to talk about some of the more overarching aspects. There's 2 major categories I'd like to group my thoughts here into, being gameplay and story. So first up, let's talk about gameplay. Overall, how good is the gameplay of Overwatch 2's PvE? Honestly, it's pretty decent. It's enjoyable enough to run around and shoot the different enemies, and the different enemy types certainly introduce levels of strategy where you have to know how to best deal with them, and I did quite enjoy the element where most enemies have multiple sort of parts on their body, where if you destroy the arm with the gun, they can't shoot anymore. If you destroy their legs, they have to sort of crawl across the ground. It makes for just a really interesting and sort of semi-dynamic element to the enemies you're actually fighting. But by and large, the PvE gameplay doesn't feel like anything too special. There isn't really anything fundamentally new here that we haven't seen done before in past PvE games of this nature, like Left 4 Dead or Back 4 Blood, and the only element which I think really added any sort of unique oomph to the gameplay itself was probably just the fact that you can select different heroes. Each hero, of course, brings their own weapons and abilities to the table, and some of them offer really unique interactions with the various enemy types. For example, Mei's Ice Wall and Blizzard can be used for some really interesting interactions in order to deal with some of the more threatening enemies you encounter, and most heroes feel like their abilities end up offering some kind of unique interactions, which make every given hero stand out amongst anyone else on the roster. That being said, not every hero feels like they really work in this game mode. Some heroes in particular feel more or less out of place with their abilities. Specifically, some of the heroes that stuck out to me in this regard were Zarya with her energy bubble, Genji with his deflect, and Cassidy with his magnetic grenade. These abilities, while certainly having some utility within the PvE realm, didn't feel like they were really good. It very much felt like it was the case that these were PvP abilities ported into a PvE environment, and as such, weren't very tightly designed for this specific type of gameplay. This by no means 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 that these heroes are unplayable in the missions, but it does add a level of clunkiness to it, where it doesn't feel as tightly designed as you'd want it to be, and it's just sort of this weird reminder that no, these heroes don't really belong in a PvE environment per se. They were originally made for PvP and have only been ported into PvE. And this ties in very closely to the replayability factor as well. A big concern I know a lot of people, myself included, had going into these story missions was the question of how replayable will they end up being. And while I do think there will be a fair bit of replayability simply when it comes to selecting and playing as different heroes, since each hero does bring something fairly unique to the actual mission, beyond just playing through the mission as different heroes and maybe just aiming for more like speedrunning type things when it comes to the harder difficulties like Legendary, I do think these missions are going to become stale pretty quickly. In the handful of times I spent replaying each of these missions, I noticed that basically the mission itself plays out identically every single time. There's no variety in terms of how enemies behave or where they spawn or how the map itself is laid out in any sort of manner. So it does seem like replayability for these story missions is hinged entirely on just playing the different heroes. And while that's an interesting angle to go for in terms of a PvE game like this, there is the fact that while there may be a decent selection of heroes on missions like the Toronto one, it's still a finite number, and I'm worried that after you've played through the mission as each of these heroes at least once or maybe even twice, there just really won't be anything else to go for in terms of playing it. Maybe if you're really into grinding and getting high scores and stuff like that, then you could aim to try to get a specific like time or score on the more higher difficulties like Legendary. But even that, I feel like, isn't going to introduce a ton of replayability. So certainly, this is something we'll have to see just as more time goes on and we've had more time to just play the missions over and over again. But I am quite concerned that the game doesn't have the replayability we were hoping it would, or at the very least would have liked to see in it. Now, before I move on to the story aspects of these missions, there is one other gameplay-related element which I would like to touch on here, which is the absence of a single-player mode. Now, I had a bit of a unique opportunity with the way I was given early access to playing the Overwatch 2 PvE, and in doing so, I actually got the opportunity to queue solo into these PvE missions, something which can only be done when playing on a server with literally nobody else on it. And as such, I got to play multiple times through the missions with only AI companions as teammates. And honestly, the friendly AI of these characters isn't that bad. It's good enough that I could consistently finish the missions on hard difficulty with them. And so I have to wonder, why is Blizzard insisting on not letting players play through the PvE missions with AI companions? I, for one, am someone who will often enjoy just playing through games like this on my own. I don't have anything against queuing with randos online that I just happen to get put in the same game with, but sometimes you just want to play through it yourself, you know? You don't want to have to worry about people screaming in voice chat or throwing or doing weird things. You just want to experience the game and the story, and Blizzard has built a sufficient framework to do that with the AI bots that'll take over when there aren't enough players. But there's no specific option for players to play it this way. Honestly, I think this was a big misstep on Blizzard's part. Granted, the AIs aren't the most intelligent of players, but they're intelligent enough that, yeah, players should be able to play this single player. I really hope this is something Blizzard changes going forward, because they've already built the tech into it for it to work, and I can only imagine they'd appeal to quite a few more people if the single player option was there. Moving on to the story of the Overwatch 2 campaign missions though, this is where Blizzard by far did a much better job than what they achieved with just the gameplay. The story here in these missions is really good. I think the cinematics are done really well. They definitely build up this feeling of tension as you're going into each of these missions, and seeing all the characters interact with each other in these cinematics and getting the different voice lines and different dialogue sequences, it's really nice, and I quite enjoy enjoyed hearing all the different interactions that can pop up between different characters on the different missions. I think they succeed with quite a few emotional beats over the course of just these 3 missions, especially in the Gothenburg mission. I think this one by far stood out among the others in terms of just the story and character, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that these 4 characters, Reinhardt, Torbjorn, Brigitte, and Bastion, all have such interesting ties to each other. They're either immediate family or old war buddies, or characters who are understandably fearful of each other. And this leads to some of the best character interactions and story moments in the entire campaign. Moments like at the end where Reinhardt and Torbjorn are talking, and Reinhardt has to accept that Torbjorn isn't gonna join them. It's this sort of sad moment where you see these old war buddies have gone separate paths in life, and they may still be friends, but they aren't really gonna be working together anymore. But then you get Brigitte and Bastion, who are basically going to become Reinhardt's new companions for the time being, so it's not all sad, it's almost bittersweet in a sense. And I think Blizzard does a really good job of landing these types of particular moments in the cutscenes and even just the general dialogue of the missions themselves. But again, I think there's the issue of story not being terribly effective in terms of replayability. Sure, someone can enjoy a single story multiple times by playing through it or watching through it or hearing it over and over again, but you really can't do that indefinitely, or even close to the amount of replayability that you would want from a game like this. The missions will almost certainly lose this element of replayability faster than they do the gameplay aspects. And also when you consider that anyone can just watch these cutscenes and interactions on YouTube or anywhere else without having to actually play through the missions, I think the story being good, unfortunately, doesn't really do as much for the PvE missions themselves as you would sort of hope they would, especially when this story is only in 3 missions. Collectively, they barely even make up the introduction to the actual story of Null Sector's war on the world, and it feels like we're only getting a tiny, insufficient tidbit of what we not only would have wanted to see, but honestly should have gotten, especially with this being the official proper debut of the Overwatch 2 PvE. That's not to diss on the good storytelling, because I for one quite love it, but without the sufficient replayable gameplay to complement it, I don't at all think the story alone is capable of pulling the PvE up to the level we'd want it to be. And this all, I think, is slowly, gradually starting to hit on the true issue I have with this initial release of the Overwatch 2 PvE in Season 6, which is that, it may sound harsh, but genuinely I think that when it comes to the amount of content we've gotten with this PvE launch, it's almost pathetic with how little they thought they could get away with releasing. The missions, for what they are good. They're honestly probably more like 2.5 missions as opposed to 3 full missions, since, well, the Rio mission, the first one, is quite literally just the BlizzCon 2019 PvE demo. They changed a few things, like they tweaked, I think, how some of the enemies work and maybe some slight adjustments to the objectives, and of course you have a slightly broader range of heroes to play as, but more than anything, this mission kinda just feels like a PvE tutorial. It's by far the shortest of the 3 missions, and the simplest in terms of the gameplay, and feels almost like a stepping stone into the PvE, like a way for people who've never played a PvE first-person shooter to get into playing a PvE first-person shooter. And that in and of itself isn't a bad thing. I think it's great that Blizzard has a sort of intro tutorial type mission like this for new players, but when that's coming at the cost of getting a proper mission, and thus we're only left with 2 other proper missions as a result, it really doesn't feel good. The other 2 missions do at the very least feel like full missions. Toronto and Gothenburg are both decently length in their own right. Toronto offers a very nice selection of heroes to play, and while Gothenburg actually only has the 4 playable characters, being Reinhardt, Torbjorn, Brigitte, and Bastion, I think they actually end up making it feel really good just by how tightly designed this mission is around the 4 characters. Every element of it feels like it plays heavily into their unique abilities and synergies with each other, such that it doesn't even feel like it really needed the bigger roster that Toronto had, and certainly in doing so, managed to circumvent the issue I mentioned earlier, where certain characters don't feel like they properly fit into the PvE itself. But still, when you're left with only these 2 missions, basically, as like the actual content for this PvE update, it's kind of pathetic that Blizzard is charging money for this. Now, a lot of people from the get-go, when they heard that it was going to be $15 to get the PvE story missions, were saying, oh, that's an outrageous price. How dare Blizzard charge $15? And I was never initially a part of that group. I was always like, I want to wait and play it for myself. I want to see how it feels, see how it actually plays. After I've experienced it, then I'll decide whether or not $15 is a good price. And now that I have played it, I'm confident in saying $15 is not a good price. And a lot of that isn't because the content itself is bad, but simply because the amount of content we get is so limited that it feels like barely even a first chapter of a story, let alone a first proper installment of story content. Overall, across these 3 missions, this very much feels like the first chapter of the story. This feels like our introduction into the story world of Overwatch 2 PvE, and we're seeing only the very tip of a huge adventure to come, but it's not enough on its own to feel like a substantial release. If anything, it almost feels like a prologue. I think if you just had the Rio and Toronto missions on their own without Gothenburg, 100% this would feel like just a prologue setup to the PvE. You'd have the intro tutorial mission with Rio, and then the first proper real mission with Toronto that introduces you to what an actual PvE mission feels like. Those 2 missions on their own, I think would actually make for a really solid introduction prologue type thing to the PvE. And honestly, I think Blizzard should have released just those 2 missions together for free. If they had done that as a sort of teaser sampling to let any player be able to just play it and see what the PvE feels like, I think they would have successfully enticed a decent number of people. Blizzard would of course have to ultimately deliver on that enticement with Gothenburg and other upcoming future story missions, but I can't help but worry over the way Blizzard has actually executed the release of this content. If I could get particularly cynical about it, it almost feels like Blizzard just took something they already had nearly completed and just released it. And it really doesn't help when we have outright proof that these missions being released right now were in development as far back as at least 2019. Rio quite literally was playable back in 2019. I played it. I know from personal experience that this mission existed 4 years ago, and we're only getting it now as part of this minuscule sampling of PvE content. And what's worse is that we know there aren't any more PvE missions that are going to be releasing for Overwatch 2 until at least 2024. We know there's at least one other PvE mission they've been developing, being the Suravasa mission where Zenyatta and Genji fight against Talon, but other than that, are there other PvE missions in the works? Maybe, but honestly, we haven't really seen any sufficient evidence of it. This is one of the things I find so genuinely concerning at this point. Why did Blizzard think they could debut the PvE with such a minuscule amount of content? This is not a sufficient content release. This isn't even an intro to the PvE. This is at most a first chapter of a story that Blizzard is desperately trying to make us all hyped for. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed playing through it a few times, and I'm sure I'll enjoy playing through it a few times more, especially if I'm playing it with friends. But considering the initial scope Blizzard had for this type of content, and all the hype and all the buildup they gave it, not even just back at BlizzCon 2019 and BlizzConline in 2021, but even leading up to the launch of Season 6, to the launch of Invasion and Blizzard's focus on getting people excited for this PvE release, it's not a sufficient delivery of content. There is simply not enough here to justify even its own existence. A lot of people have compared these missions to being glorified archives missions, and in a lot of ways they are, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think it's the way Blizzard has gone about marketing the PvE as this huge, cool thing that's almost its own standalone separate of the PvP. It is absolutely not that. I'm not exactly sure who Blizzard is intending to capture in terms of a market of players with this PvE, but I guarantee you it won't be bringing in new players. It's not sufficient as a game to bring in new players. I think it'll be quite satisfying for existing players, the people who enjoyed archives, and even probably a lot of people who only play PvP type games and happen to play Overwatch. They'll probably get some fun out of playing through the missions at least once or twice, but it really does kind of feel like this is just Blizzard dumping out what they had, trying to sell it for whatever they can squeeze from their audience, because they'd already dumped 4+ years of work into developing it, so they might as well release it, even though it's not a full proper game. Now, after having successfully derailed myself from my own script and gone onto a horribly skewed tangent of my own thoughts, I do suppose I still need to talk a little bit about the Underworld PvE Event mission. This, from what we can tell, is the sort of remnants of the hero missions, which were originally intended to be the highly replayable component of the Overwatch 2 PvE that had the whole talent trees and everything, as this very much feels like a non-canon, just sort of like fun mode that uses PvE mechanics. Honestly, the impression I got when playing this is it felt very much like workshop content for games like Left 4 Dead 2. For those of you who've played Left 4 Dead 2, I'm sure you know the main story missions that were officially made by Valve are the really cool, really tightly designed, really fun, really replayable missions featuring the main cast of characters. But then through workshop and modding tools, people were able to basically just make their own additional campaign missions using those same elements and enemies and characters from the main campaign in their own little side projects. And a lot of those can be really fun, and to that end, I do think this Underworld PvE mission is fairly fun. But it definitely lacks that level of polish which we see in the actual campaign missions. The level itself doesn't feel as tightly designed, the characters don't all quite have the proper voice lines for what's going on, and the mission itself feels a little clunky in terms of its objectives and overall how it actually plays out. With that being said, it does still make for some decent, fun PvE gameplay. Just shooting at robots, doing the little objectives, playing your favorite heroes, though to be honest, having only these 4 characters available in the PvE event with no other options to choose from, kind of underwhelming. Wish we would have had more heroes we could play as here. But even if there were more hero options and the objectives were more varied and more in-depth in terms of the actual gameplay of it, I think it would still probably suffer from the exact same issue as the story campaign missions, which is that it overall just feels underwhelming. It's this one mission we have, and granted there are different variants to the mission itself which will be playing out over the weeks of the event, and it is nice that it is a free event so anyone can play it without having to purchase the story missions, but still it just feels so minuscule, so little. Just why isn't there more? I am curious to see how many of these PvE events will be released over the months and seasons ahead, because honestly, if we did get one of these every season, that would be pretty nice. That would be a fun, small amount of PvE content for us to regularly get, and I'm sure I'd enjoy playing through each new one we got. But based off of just everything Blizzard has done over the past years, I honestly can't get my hopes up for even these small-scale PvE event missions to be releasing that frequently. Maybe there'll be more in upcoming seasons, maybe they're going to be a once-a-year thing like archives used to be, I don't know, but honestly, it just really feels insufficient. And considering what it was supposed to be with the hero missions and the talent trees and all that way back in the earlier days of Overwatch 2's development, it does just sort of feel like a sorry, dumped out mode that Blizzard put out because they'd already put in 90% of the work behind it and didn't want that to go to waste. It feels like leftover scraps of a game mode, and sure, that can still be a fun thing to play through, but overall, honestly, I think it sort of speaks for the entirety of PvE in that it just feels like an unfinished remnant of something that could have been great and had such ambition and vision behind it, only for it to presumably have been butchered beyond repair by who knows what sort of internal factors, and as such we get this. Is it good for what it is? Sure. But is it what they hyped it up to be and what people wanted and deserved after waiting 4+ years? Absolutely not. And so if you've watched this far and want to know my thoughts on whether or not you should spend $15 to purchase the Overwatch 2 PvE, honestly, overall, no. I don't think it's worth it. If you're really into the story and really into the characters, or maybe just really into these style of PvE games, then sure, $15 I guess isn't an awful price, especially if you can make use of the other coins and stuff you get alongside it. But in terms of it being its own thing, its own reason to install Overwatch 2, its own reason to care about the characters and this world and the game itself, it's simply not that. And I'm not sure that it ever will be. Who knows? Maybe Blizzard will wow us in the future with really exciting, really extensive expansions building off of these initial missions, but at this point, I'm content to just play it, have fun with it every now and again, and otherwise, I'll stick to the PvP. I still enjoy the PvP enough that I'm not going to give up on Overwatch anytime soon, but for me at least, I think that long-standing PvE dream of mine is something that I can finally just sort of put to rest. We got it. It wasn't what we wanted it to be. It wasn't what it deserved to be, but we got it. And on that note, thank you all so much for watching this very long, very rambly sort of take on the Overwatch 2 PvE. I actually did a handful of different takes of this video because I tried to have a more structured format going into it, but then I just kept sort of devolving into my tirades about how pathetically insufficient the content we got with it is. So, you know, things turn out how they turn out, I guess. Just like this video, just like the PvE. And on that note, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on all this in the comments down below. Have you enjoyed the Overwatch 2 PvE? Do you think it's something you'll play time and time again for months, if not years to come? Or did you maybe not even bother spending money on it? Either way, I'd love to hear from you, and as always, be sure to subscribe, hit up that bell icon, follow me on X, and join my Discord server to hang out and never miss any future Overwatch news and content, and special thanks to my YouTube channel members who help make these videos possible. If you'd like to join them to earn some cool rewards, then just hit that join button down below, and otherwise, this is Master Ian Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.